The Job in Briarwood by John Van Stan. Joe Fernarkey was a one-man construction shop, the way a storyteller is a one-man theater. He arrived with his truck, self-maintained stickers from dead bands and state parks, unfolded the sawhorses, and then filled the quiet with talk until the day had a plot. But we all have contradictions, and Joe's was that he talked like a crew, but worked like a hermit. The day's sawdust settled on an empty stage. The applause was a homeowner's dog barking as the storm door creaked, or a podcast on the loudspeaker. On I-90, he gave the day its opening monologue. "All right, Pilgrim," he told the dash, patting cracked vinyl. "Keep the hummin' key and I'll keep the nails honest. We've got a ledger that wants kindness, and some old vinyl that needs forgiveness. You bring the rattle, I'll bring the level, and between us we'll convince the day to be square." The truck answered with its favorite rattle under the glove box, his percussion section warming up as he slid an old CD into the slot. A live set recorded in a Lakewood basement, his band. Joe played guitar and sang backup, the harmony high and a little ghostly. He kept the disc in rotation for maintenance, lyrics to keep sharp, chord changes to keep under his fingers. "Verse, chorus, bridge," he told the dash. He drummed the wheel on the downbeat and let his younger self count him in. Joe had sampled most of what the century brewed and never got stuck to any of it. He'd traveled far enough in his 20s to come back with his pockets full of metaphors instead of habits. What took permanently was wood. He learned how to judge grain by touch, how to seat hardware without strain, how to keep a line true across a run of bad material. He was hyper-creative in a way that made inspectors sigh and then nod, railings that seemed to float and somehow met code, stairs that swirled up into the air but stood like stone. If cash felt too literal, he'd barter, swap a weekend redeck for a neighbor's kiln-dried cherry that they'd been hoarding. He trusted that if you treated materials kindly, the world would, on average, not bite you. Today's job was in Briarwood, a neighborhood that sounded more enchanting on paper. In reality, it was a forgotten pocket of the county, where a grid of 1950s bungalows was slowly being swallowed by a forest that didn't seem to belong in Northeast Ohio. Joe's phone GPS wanted him to stay on the interstate, but he took the exit for the old state route instead, the road with rust on it. His phones rarely knew his routes anyway. He retired them often, sometimes for cracks, sometimes for a careless wrench, and mostly for swearing their digital level was true a second before falling off the board. The interstate peeled away to the left as Joe eased onto the old state route. In the mirror, distance compressed rapidly. The stack of overpasses flattened into a strip. Exit boards shrank, letters crowding each other, then slipping into gray. Radio towers behind him thinned to wire and dots of light. The lights disappeared into day while the wire lattice wavered more and more with each 10th mile, until they lost their edges and went colorless in a blur. He adjusted the mirror once, then again, but the perspective stayed as it was. The pavement took his inputs too well. A touch on the brake drew the horizon nearer. A light press on the gas set the road listing away. The rises and dips matched his footwork with an accuracy that felt rehearsed. A mile on, a cinder-block gas station appeared in the bend. White block walls, a sun-bleached Pepsi sign, and a single, thick-ankled pump. It was too far from the highway for travelers, and too far from Briarwood for residents. Joe's tank was half full, but he pulled in anyway. He'd started thinking in fractions, talking aloud. "Half a tank, half a world in the mirrors, half a reason to stop." He chuckled. The truck settled on the gravel, and the world behind him shrank another notch. "Hell of a road," he continued, talking to no one. "Feels tuned to me." He left the engine idling while he found his wallet. He glanced at the empty seat. Damn, forgot the almonds. Half a lunch. He killed the engine. The ticks of cooling metal sounded far away. He stepped out mumbling, "Maybe everything's just drawn into one big can of nuts." Something in the back of his mind kept tugging. The way the road had answered the pedals reminded him of the delicate work of fly fishing, a rhythm built on attention, patience, and trickery. He thought of the looping cast, the slack taken up, the silent hope that something unseen might rise to meet the lure. He smiled at the idea. "The whole world's fishing for something," he said, stopping short of examining what the world was fishing for today. He walked to the station door, thinking about rods, lines, currents, and trying to remember his last fishing trip. He took the handle of the door and pulled. The glass gave a small shudder against the frame. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed an electrical overtone chorus. Joe swore he could hear the classic 1-4-5 chord progression in it. The air carried antifreeze, old coffee, and cardboard. The cooler fans turned without hurry. The television in the corner struggled with its picture, a static ghosting over a weatherman. The captions settled, broke, and returned to unusual skies, formations. To the left of the door was a strip of flypaper, hanging straight and clean. No flies, no specks, no dust, not even a scrap of old web. Ohio in late summer made flies for sport, and here there weren't any. Joe let out a mildly impressed, "Huh." He crossed to the cooler and took a bottle of water. Condensation broke and ran down the plastic. The almonds were in a tin, small, with a pull-tab lid that looked older than it should. He set both on the counter. The attendant stood up from behind it. Thin man, maybe 60, maybe ageless, with a mustache that belonged in a daguerreotype. Name tag at an angle. Dennis. His eyes went to Joe's rough hands, his boots, the pencil behind his ear, then back to his face. He nodded once, the way you acknowledge someone you've been expecting. "Briarwood," Dennis said, not a question. "Yeah, how'd you—" "Only place left out that way." Dennis rang up the water without looking at it. "Got work out there?" "Ledger board to marry to some vinyl siding. Nothing fancy." Dennis's eyes drifted toward the window. The pump stood alone in the gravel. Beyond it, the tree line pressed close, darker than the full morning sunlight should allow. "Some trees out there bend the wind wrong," he said. "Wind goes north, they lean south. You'll see it." He paused, fingers resting on the register. "Clouds, too. Not real clouds. Not sky stuff." Joe smiled the smile he used for homeowners who'd watched too much HGTV. "Long as they respect the property line, we'll get along." Dennis didn't smile back. "Don't build nothing past that edge." Faster now. Quieter. "That land don't want shapes forced on it. Don't want corners. Don't want—" He stopped himself, shook his head a little, then rang up the almonds. The total appeared. $9.50. Joe reached for his wallet. "Could you throw 30 on the pump for me, too?" Joe asked, fishing out a pair of 20s and sliding them across the table. The strip of flypaper trembled. No breeze and still no fly. "What's the edge?" Dennis took Joe's 20s with the caution of a man handling live wire, answering. "Where the survey flag stopped holding. They had a crew lay string out there 3 summers back, bright pink through the weeds. Next morning the string had moved itself to where the path already was." He dragged the register drawer open. "Not pulled, not kids. The line refused. Foreman's word, you see. Refused." Dennis finally laid the bills to rest and began making up the change. "They sent others, used spray paint on the trunks instead. Blue markers every 10 feet, Barter. Blue didn't stay where they put it." Joe's laugh came out easy. "Blue's got preferences." "You'll see the flags if you go looking. They're all in the same place now, lined up nice." He met Joe's eyes. "Lined up where they wanted to be." Joe pocketed the change and tucked the water bottle into his back pocket. "You get many contractors out this way?" he asked, bringing cheer into the question because cheer didn't cost extra and sometimes altered the grain. "Not twice," Dennis said kindly. He wasn't making it cruel and he wasn't making it dramatic. "They go in, they finish. They don't take the next one when it's there. You can ask 'em why. They'll say they're full up. They say they're going to Florida or Georgia, one of them southern states, for a few months. I don't push." Joe picked up his almonds. "Buddy," he said, "have you looked at a code book? The universe loves a change order." Dennis handed him the receipt without comment. His eyes had already moved past Joe, to the door, to the road beyond, to whatever he saw. On the way out, Joe looked at the television. The weatherman's hand drew an arc that could have been lake effect or someone smoothing a tablecloth. The audio found itself for a moment. "Reports of unusual formations, alto stratus with..." With every word captioned, one at a time in caps at very regular intervals, then the static returned overwhelmingly. Outside, Joe worked the nozzle into the tank and squeezed the trigger. The pump clicked and hummed its slow arithmetic. Numbers rolled over, gallons adding to the half-tank that had brought him here. Above the pump, bees circled an old Pepsi sign in a typical late summer frenzy, but each loop stuttered at the same point, a little hiccup in their figure eights as if they'd found a seam in the afternoon and couldn't quite cross it. Joe watched until the pump clicked off with a thunk. He replaced the nozzle, screwed the cap tight, and looked up while climbing back into the truck. The clouds wore a lopsidedness that wanted a word. "Mammatus?" Joe thought. He set the bottle in the holder, balanced the almonds on the dash, and set the CD back to track 2. Track 1's counting in was for pulling away from home. Track 2 was for pulling into a job. The truck gave him its little tambourine rattle under the glove box. "Verse, chorus, bridge," he said softly, and eased back onto the road. The subdivision came on as a scent before it came on as a place. Cut grass, wet soil, a plastic note like new hose. Above that, the sky's odd shape held, patient and present. Joe crested the low rise where the state route gave way to Briarwood's frayed welcome. A chain-link scar that pinned back the underbrush. Links bowed under too much tension. The neighborhood unfolded below. Bungalows hunkered in their half-acre plots. Aluminum roofs glinting under a blue sky. The kind of blue that swallowed light instead of scattering it. It pooled overhead, deep as ink in a well, but daylight all the same. No stars pricking through, just the sun's white insistence, punching a near-clean hole in the center. The sun didn't even have a halo, but it did have faint scratches that worked through the inky blue. Joe thought of a board he'd planed too thin once, about how the light worked its way through the grains. Could the sky have been planed too thin here, and the void was leaking in? He eased the truck down the grade. That's when the clouds made their bid for attention. They weren't drifting overhead. They clung to the forest's shoulders, a bruised collar around the subdivision's neck. Rough-hewn things, those clouds. Edges hacked blunt, not the soft dissolve of cumulus or the feathered high-flung and carefree reach of cirrus. They boiled at the property lines, fraying and reforming in fits that spoke of a grudge. One bulge thrust high over a chain-link fence, only to shear back. Another gnashed at the tree line's margin, spilling gray tendrils that snapped short of the mowed grass and retreated with a sullen curl. Frustrated was the word his mind supplied. They wanted in, wanted to smother the tidy rectangles and straight-run driveways. The blue above Briarwood held the line. "That ain't a sky," Joe thought aloud. That's a thin-planed lid, sealed tight." He turned down the CD. The silence didn't feel regular, so he started whistling the harmony line on its own, filling the cab with something familiar. At the last curve before the drop, he passed a bent speed limit sign with a bright strip of woven nylon knotted around it. An old leash fragment, he thought. If it was a leash, it was tattered at the free end. Something with teeth had worried it through. Joe contemplated the strength of different animals' teeth until he pulled to the curb outside 1427 Elm and cut the engine. The truck settled with its usual ticks, but overhead a low hum persisted. He listened. Wind through untuned strings. That'd put a nice burr on the next album. He pictured it, layering a field recording under the bridge of the song Wondrous Stuff. And while he thought about how to get Wind to play an electric guitar, he stepped out, shading his eyes against that brutal blue. The clouds at the forest's edge hadn't moved any closer, but they had moved about and certainly hadn't retreated. They waited. The job site sat quiet, a squat rancher with vinyl siding peeling at the seams. Joe's antagonist was in the backyard, an errant ledger board sagging where it met the foundation. Simple fix, a little over half a day's work, maybe less. He slung his tool belt around his waist, thumbed the gate latch to the side yard, and the backyard unfolded behind the bungalow. Neat yard, suburban postcard stuff. Geometric lawn clipped to precision, green as an emerald without a single dandelion. A herd of Adirondack chairs had settled in the grass, facing the back fence. Chain link ran straight around the perimeter. Joe crossed the lawn toward the sagging ledger board, tape measure already in hand, and that's when he saw movement. Low, fast, hugging the fence line to his left, something dark, wide as a man's shoulders, but belly flat to the dirt, churning through the underbrush just beyond the chain link. Not the casual prowl of a raccoon rooting for grubs, nor the scamper of some stray dog. This was urgent, horizontal, lurching. A tar-black smear dragging itself forward in bumpy hitches, about the size of a raccoon, but without any waddle, any grace. It pulled more than it crawled, like a hooked lure fighting the current, limbs or whatever passed for them flailing in spasms that kicked up no leaves. The hum in the ground spiked with it, a bass throb sinking to the drag, thump, thump, as if the soil were hauling on the line. Joe stopped mid-stride. "Hey!" he barked at the fence. The shape was gone in a blink, swallowed by the understory. But a bright scrap of something remained where it had paused. A slash of color in the weeds. Pink. Pale, salmony pink. His mind snapped to the homeowner. Mr. Farkas and his fedora fetish. The man always wore some brimmed folly in a cheerful color. Joe had seen him in a white one at the initial walkthrough, then a pastel pink number later that week, and the wife had joked, "He's got every pastel under the sun." Hat blew off in a gust? Guy chasing it down on all fours? The thought landed easy, a cover track for the weird. "Farkas?" he called. "That you out there, buddy? Lose your lid?" Joe walked to the fence, boots printing the perfect grass. With each step, that hum tightened across his chest. No answer, just the sky's steady drone, and then, deeper in the brush, a settling. Not a rustle or retreat, but a wet, muffled schlup, like sodden cloth folding in on itself. It receded, sure, but not away. Down, deeper into the understory's gut, the sound dopplering into a faint, fleshy thrum that vibrated up through the chain link and into his palms. Joe gripped the wire, links warm and slick under his fingers, and peered into the trees. No animal, just that pink scrap. And it wasn't a hat after all. A frayed ribbon on a stake, half buried, the color bleeding watercolor pale. It was a survey flag, exactly as Dennis had said, planted in the ground right where the dark shape had been. There, another flag 10 feet down, and another, a slim path of them barely visible as a shallow depression, a channel where something had passed often enough to press the leaves into a run. "Raccoon," Joe said aloud, but the word came out thin. "Injured raccoon." He crouched, both hands on the fence. He stared at the path of pink flags, at the depression in the leaves, at the way the understory seemed to lean toward the trail as if pulled by a current. "Injured," he said again, quieter. "Really dark fur, light catching something, maybe a collar." The gait replayed in his head. "Hell of a way to move." He stayed there, crouched, looking where the flags disappeared into shadow. The clouds at the tree line churned without sound. The blue overhead pressed down. Somewhere in the distance, something moved along that path of pink markers, following the line where the surveyor's string had refused to stay. Joe stood slowly and looked back at the house, at the ledger board waiting, sagging on, oblivious. "Raccoon," he said one more time, backing away from the fence. His hands trembled a little when he pulled the tape. The ledger board waited, a simple repair that began to feel like a performance. Joe knelt beside it, ran his hand along the rot-soft pine where it met the foundation. Standard fix, sister board, lag screws flashing. He'd done it 100 times. But the yard felt different now. The trees leaned in without moving. The blue waited. Even the clouds at the edge seemed to pause their churning to watch him work. That was when he felt it proper. The prickle rising up the spine, the static of a hot amp in a crowded room. He started to talk. To the trees, to the level, to the nails in their plastic belt. "You little meteors, don't you curve on me today." To the absent dog. Where was that dog today? "Buddy, you're management now. Eyes on the line." To the air itself. He kept a patter going so the day felt fastened as much by speech as by screws. When the woods went a shade too still, when a breeze crossed and didn't move a leaf, he raised his voice and told longer stories. "Built a deck in Lorraine once," he said, Torque's bit singing, "and the sap bled sweet out of a pressure-treated board like it remembered being pine, or dreamt of it. I told it could tell the dream once. By lunch it was done. Everything talks if you let it." He chuckled toward the trees. "So what's your verse, fellas? Got a bridge? Or are we freestyling?" No answer from the trees. Just the ground hum droning on, a loop pedal stuck in the red. Joe shook it off and tightened his belt, leather creaking the downbeat. He marked the sister board with his pencil, lined up the drill, and tried not to think about the flags, or the thing that had moved between them, or the way the path led deeper into woods that didn't want corners. "Fine," Joe said to the silent audience. "Won't talk? I'll bring some company." He pulled the Bluetooth speaker from his toolbox, thumbed it on. The pairing chime cut clean through the quiet. He queued up a podcast, The Carpenter's Cut, something about reading grain, and hit play. The host's voice came through, warm and familiar.
You have to develop an eye for what the wood is telling you. Every knot, every twist is a story.
Joe relaxed into the rhythm, positioned the sister board, marked his holes, background noise for coursework. But as he worked, an old radio static crept in. Just odd crackle at first.
Start a story, written the growth strings.
That static hiss hit all the S's and F's and anything soft. Joe started to listen a little closer, and the phrase repeated, but it was a little different. He was sure of it.
Growth's strings that refuse to run straight.
Static underneath, too. Faint, like breath between sentences. The guest spoke, a woman's voice.
The woods will guide your hand if you let it.
Joe put his attention back to his power drill for a few moments. Then he heard another repetition.
Guide your hands, guide your feet, follows where it leads.
Joe paused. Where was that static coming from? And those S sounds were stretching now, subtle but clearly present. He glanced at his phone. It had service, all the bars. The episode played normally, but the speaker seemed to be talking at a different rate or quality.
The path
already
there.
laid before you, came the pink guide that knows the way. He looked up. The clouds at the forest's edge had stopped their churning. They hung now still, and in that stillness was something like patience. Could it be invitation? The blue deepened, and Joe noticed for the first time how beautiful it was. That impossible, swallowing, beautiful blue. Like looking up from the bottom of a well into something vaster than sky. The voices merged now, host and guest and static, weaving together.
Soft earth.
Beyond the fences, where's corners,
Dissolves.
where's you can rest.
Joe found himself standing. When had he stood? The drill hung loose in his hand. He looked at the fence line, at the pink flags peeking through the chain link gaps, and they seemed less like warnings now and more like markers. A path someone had laid with care. The depression between them, that channel in the understory. It was all an opening, a way through.
Just a few steps past the edges where the woods grows true.
The sun's light caught the leaves beyond the fence, and Joe saw how it filtered through. Those sun ray scratches in the blue weren't damage. They were apertures. The light coming through had texture, had grain, like it had passed through something older than air. The tree limbs swayed independent of it all. Their movement had rhythm, also independent of the world pressing in on us all. It was the same rhythm as the ground thrum, as the voices from the speaker, as his own pulse in his ears. It was beautiful. God, it was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made you small, that made your careful corners and true lines seem like a child's game. Out there, past the fence, past the edge, past the flags. That's where things grew the way they were meant to grow. Curved, flowing, free from right angles and code books and the tyranny of plumb. The truth of it all tweaked the voices into a single chain of thought without hiss, without any distortions, just clear, cool words.
You won't have to talk anymore.
Won't have to fill the silence.
The silence will
Fill.
you.
Joe took a step toward the fence. The grass felt different under his boots. The blades slid under his heels, bowed and springy, aiding every step forward. More than helping, welcoming. Another step, then another. The pink flags seemed to brighten, or maybe his eyes were adjusting to see them properly in the patterned light and shadow. They marked the way in, the path that had always been there, waiting for someone to stop refusing and just enter. His hand reached for the fence. The top post was warm, almost hot, and it hummed under his palm with that same frequency he'd been hearing all day. Not wrong, not a warning, a signal, a call. He could climb it easily, just over the top, follow the flags. walk that settled path into the understory where the light came through in grains and the trees knew better than to want corners, and... The drill slipped from his other hand, hit the grass with a muffled thump, and the trigger depressed a moment, releasing a sharp, punctuated zzz from the motor. Joe's head jerked to look down at the drill, then to his hand on the fence. He yanked his hand back like the fence had burned him, stumbled backward 3 steps, 4. The podcast blasted through the loudspeaker, loud and clear as if it hadn't stopped. When had it kept playing? A woman's voice, mid-phrase, swelled.
And that's when you know the grain is hiding something.
Before the speaker volume returned to normal, the podcast continued. Joe looked toward the speaker and realized he was 20 feet from where he'd been working. He was that distance closer to the fence and looked out that way again. The trees beyond hung still now, waiting. The pink flags marked their path. The clouds at the tree line had resumed their churning. "No," said Joe, his voice came out hoarse. "No. Nope. Not today. Not ever." He backed away from his tools, but he didn't pick up the drill. Not yet. He stood there staring at the woods. Had they almost convinced him that corners were the problem? That his careful right angles were a rebellion against something older? His hands shook, but it wasn't just fear. Part of him still felt the pool, still saw that beautiful, terrible light filtering through the scratched blue. Still heard that merged voice promising rest. He picked up his gas station water and took a long drink. It was colder than he thought it should have been. The shiver it sent through him shook something loose in his chest. A loose-lipped escaped him before he turned to the ledger board. "Bad connection," he said to the ledger board. "Trees jamming the signal." But when he finally picked up the drill and got back to work, he kept his back to the fence. Joe powered the drill back to life, the whir a defiant riff. He drove the lag screws home one by one, chunk, swoop, chunk, the bits chewing into the sister board with satisfying bite, pine shavings curling. The rhythm steadied him, mark, align, drive, repeat, a backbeat against the blues pressure and the fence's forgotten hum. "There you go, Pilgrim," he murmured to the ledger, wiping sweat from his brow at the back of his wrist. "Married up nice. No more sagging solos." The patio bricks drank the heat of his palms as he reached for the flashing roll, tin shears snipping sharp, tick, tick, tick along the seam. Clean lines, code compliant, his small rebellions against the curves out there. From the tree line came a new sound, a faint pat, pat, patter, like dry seeds rattling in a gourd. Acorns? Joe cocked his head mid-snip, shears hovering. The sound swelled. 20 solid seconds of dry patter, full and steady. Acorns meeting leaves, meeting earth. He looked up to triangulate where they were coming from. Left, right, crown, trunk. None of it lined up. No source. He went back to the screws, trying to ignore it, but the acorns kept coming. It was a dry waterfall without origin or end, threading under his chunk zip. Joe stopped and listened again. It stopped on a beat. He had to make a cut, and he took advantage of the opportunity to make some noise. The circular saw lifted a high whine. The woods sent back birdsong. Clear notes, textbook intervals. When the cut stopped, he tipped his head to spot the singer, but no wings flashed, no shadows crossed. He scanned the fence line, leaves, flags. No birds. The canopy hung barren of motion, a solid curtain save for gaps, those diamond voids where light scratched through. "Where's everybody hiding?" he said to the yard. He expected a squirrel tail, a chipmunk, the low brown flank of a rabbit. There was none of it. No bee past his ear. The perfect lawn had no ants on it. The yard was empty, pristine, animal-free save for that raccoon. It was a raccoon, remember? The words looped in his head, a mantra against the drag's memory. Thump, sh, thump, the schlup folding into earth. Injured, collar glint, nothing more. But the realization settled cold in his gut. No birds meant no nests. No insects meant no web. The whole forest fringe felt emptied. A stage cleared for something else's act. And his work sounds. The shears tick, the hammers testing tap-tap on the flashing, were just the interval music, filling the void till curtain. From the woods came 4 wet thumps, space to match him. He froze. The force dropped back to its drone and waited. He touched the trigger once more just to test himself, and nothing answered this time. He breathed out. Okay. He fit flashing. The metal rasped against the foundation. Behind the fence, a thin tearing began. A scrape of something moving through leaves without moving leaves. It stayed even when he stood still, so he let the metal fall flat on the grass. The tearing stopped. He pocketed a driver bit and watched the tree line. The clouds had resumed their slow churn, but within the canopy, gaps were different now. Small windows opened and closed in the canopy. Not from the wind, not a simple shuffle of foliage. Spaces formed and held, then displaced themselves, then tried again. A low oval cleared, shifted vertical, widened at the top, narrowed at the bottom, as if a face were being practiced. It broke. Another gap made a slit, then 2. Sometimes ovals, sometimes hexagonal forms, always something face-like. But they did not look at him. They looked for him. Joe took a step sideways. The sun-flecked shapes did not follow. They opened where he'd been, late by a full breath. He took 3 quick steps the other way. The gaps formed at the wrong coordinates again, feeling along for a man who had already moved. He swallowed. "You don't know where I am," he said more to himself than to the shapes. He snapped a chalk line for the ledger cap. The blue cord popped across the siding with a sharp, satisfying crack. The canopy's apertures shuddered, opened again in a stuttering pattern, as if that single right angle had jammed their bearings. The shapes kept searching, a dozen half-gods fumbling for his frequency, the acorns rattling endless applause from the void, the birds keening for a perch that wasn't there. He put his square to the board, checked 90, checked it again, and the shapes in the leaves failed to lock him. Their margins trembled, and then collapsed into leaf again, then returned at a distance wrong just enough to matter. It seemed that it was not that they couldn't see, it was that they couldn't place. The yard's rectangles, the house's grid, the snapped chalk, the flashing's sharp L. Did his world of measured corners throw off their search by degrees they could not correct? Stay in the box, he told himself. The words steadied his hands. Corners and code, corners and code. That just might be our church here. From the left, the acorn pour resumed at a new mid-air address. He tried again to hear a trunk under it, but nothing. Across the fence, bird notes returned with greater effort, louder, combining calls that didn't coexist. Robin, jay, 2 wrens at once, a gull from a lake a dozen miles off, all layered together, then stopping mid-syllable on a shared cutoff, as if one mouth had been doing all of it and lost the word. He pulled the nailer's trigger to set the cap and got silence in reply. He tapped the cap down with the butt of his fist, and the woods gave him the 4 wet thumps again, a beat late. He lifted the level to the bubble. The bubble steadied on the center. and the trees and openings steadied too, a neat ellipse close to an eye, then swam away into shredded green. "That raccoon," he said, reminding himself. "Just the raccoon." He put his shoulder to the ledger and sunk 2 GRKs. The driver bit sang clean. The forest answered with a sound that was not a pour and not a thump. Another one of those soft, continuous rains of small, hard things landing on soft things, moving across the canopy, never touching the ground he could see. He stopped the podcast. The speaker clicked and the day's real sound rolled in. No dog, no distant mower, no traffic bleed, only the hum in the sky and the wood trying to organize itself into sight. He looked for movement again. Any movement that wasn't his. None. The understory held its pose. The flags did not flutter. The pinks kept their patient line into the shadowed run. Even the flies were missing. He lifted the square once more and pressed it to the sister. The corner met. He kept the tool in place and said low to the space beyond the fence, "You can't read this, can you?" A breeze crossed the yard. The grass laid down and stood back up. The leaves near the fence showed their undersides briefly all at once, then turned them away. Every gap failed to make a face. He finished the fasteners on the cap and stood up to stretch his back. The acorns poured again, longer now. The sound passed behind him, then in front, underscoring nothing visible. He let it end without chasing it. Then a dark thought rose, simple as a carpenter's note. They can't fix you on the map. He looked down at the chalk on his fingers, the square on his thigh, the right angle of his tools laid out on the grass. The yard had been staked and measured. His work threw plumb and level across it. He existed within that grid, and whatever pressed its faces against the leaves did not. He set the driver aside and took the broom to clear his mess. Each push of sawdust gathered a little more silence and kept it near. Each sweep drew a new pause from the trees and a new failure in their openings. The work was done. Ledger board married to vinyl, flashing seated, cap fastened true. He ran his hand along the seam, clean, flush, no give. Professional. He should pack up, load the truck, get paid, and get gone. But he didn't move. Instead, he found himself staring at the fence again, at those patient pink flags marking their path into the understory. The shapes in the canopy had gone still. Their searching seemed to have paused, waiting. The acorn sound had stopped. The bird song had died mid-note. Even the ground hum had dropped to a whisper. This time the stillness pulled him. The sudden, absolute quiet after all that frantic searching. Like they'd given up. Like they'd retreated. Or like they're holding their breath, Joe said as he started a slow walk toward the fence. He didn't decide to. His legs simply carried him forward. The closer he got, the lighter he felt. The weight of his tool belt, the ache in his lower back, the thirst scratching his throat, all of it began to lift steadily. By the time he reached the chain link, he almost felt hollow or buoyant, like he could rise off the ground if he just let go. He wrapped both hands around the straight top post. The metal was warm enough to be a warning. He shook his head, gripped his hands tight, and shouted to the woods, "You can't have me!" His voice came out stronger than he felt, and he had more to say. "You can't even find me. I'm all corners and you're all curves, and that's how it stays." He pushed against the post, just to prove it, just to show them. The metal gave. Not much. Just a slight bend at the top, twisting a few degrees out of true. But it was enough. The geometry broke, the right angle failed, and in that instant of surrender, of one corner giving way to curve, the shapes in the canopy locked. Every gap snapped into alignment at once, dozens of them, ovals, hexagons, diamond voids, all swiveling in unison to fix on the exact coordinates where Joe stood. And through each opening, light poured. Not sunlight, not anymore. This was harder and older. It came in shafts that had edges, planes that intersected at angles that hurt to perceive. The beams first converged on Joe's chest, then his shoulders and face, overlapping into a lattice of illumination that didn't warm. It took. Joe tried to step back. His boots wouldn't move. He looked down and saw his shadow spreading across the grass, darkening, thickening. It wasn't falling away from the light. It was being pulled toward the fence, stretching like taffy toward the gap at the bottom of the chain link. His shadow went first, flattening, elongating, seeping under the wire, and then his body followed. The light pressed him down with piercing fingers. His knees buckled. He hit the grass on all fours and kept going, belly to the ground, arms splaying forward. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs wouldn't obey. They scrabbled uselessly, fingers clawing dirt, boots kicking at nothing. The pulling intensified. His chest scraped the grass, then his face dragged forward inch by inch toward the fence. Thump, thump. The sound came from his own body now. The same lurching, bumpy gait he'd seen from that thing in the underbrush. Because it hadn't been a raccoon. It had been this, something caught, something being hauled through the fence one agonizing inch at a time, flattened and darkened and dragged. The chain link loomed huge. The diamonds of wire were portals now, each gap a mouth waiting to swallow him piece by piece. His hand reached the fence, fingers threading through the wire of their own accord. His arm followed, sliding through a gap too small for any arm, the metal scraping skin, but not tearing because he wasn't solid anymore. He was flattening, compressing, being translated from 3 dimensions into something that could slip between. No, this is how you go. This is how they take you. He tried to scream, but the light was in his mouth, down his throat, filling him. The pink flags waited on the other side, marking the path he would follow once he was through, the path all the others had followed, into the woods where corners dissolved, and men became dark smears dragged along settled trails toward. Teeth clamped onto his ankle. The shock of it, a sudden, real animal, broke the lattice for half a second. Joe twisted his head and saw fur, brown and white, a dog's determined face locked onto his boot, pulling with desperate strength, haunches low, paws scrabbling in the grass. An enormous doodle, the Farkas's dog, with a nylon leash trailing from its collar, frayed at the end where it had been chewed through. The dog yanked hard. Joe's body jerked backwards several inches. The light shafts flickered, broke alignment, reconnected at the wrong angles. The pulling sensation weakened. His chest lifted an inch off the ground. "Good," Joe gasped. "Good dog. Good." The doodle pulled again, teeth grinding leather, and Joe's other hand came free of the fence with a sound like tearing cloth. He pushed with his elbows. The dog hauled backward. Another foot gained. Another. The light shafts bent, trying to recapture him, but the dog kept moving, kept pulling, broke the geometry faster than it could reform. Then Joe was free. Sprawled on his back in the grass, he saw the dog standing over him, panting, leash dangling. The lattice of light snapped shut. The canopy gaps went dark, and from the woods came a sound Joe had never heard and never wanted to hear again. Screaming? Not animal, not human. A shriek of wood under impossible stress. Stems bending past breaking, fibers tearing in their grain. It came from everywhere at once, a chorus of groaning, splintering agony that rose and rose until it cracked the air itself. The shapes were searching. frantically now, gaps opening and closing in rapid succession all along the fence, sweeping back and sweeping forth, checking coordinates, rechecking. Where did he go? But Joe was already moving. On his feet, stumbling backward, the dog keeping pace beside him. He looked at the ledger board. Done. The work was done. Good God, he'd finished it. Whenever, he'd finished the whole job. The flashing gleamed, the fasteners were set, the cap sat true. So he grabbed his toolbox, left the broom, the sawdust, half his bits scattered in the grass. The dog followed him through the side gate. Behind them, the screaming continued, desperate, furious and searching. His truck sat where he'd left it. Real, solid, corners and right angles and Detroit steel. He threw his toolbox in the bed, opened the driver's door. The dog vaulted into the passenger seat like it had always belonged there. Then Joe climbed in. His hand shook so badly he dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. The engine turned over. Blessed, normal combustion. And he threw it in drive without looking back at the house. The street was empty. Every house sat quiet. No cars, no people, no dogs except the one beside him, panting softly, watching him with imploring brown eyes. Joe took the first turn too fast, tires squealing, then the second. The subdivision streets blurred together. Maple, oak, elm, all the tree names for a place the trees were trying to swallow. He didn't slow down until he hit the main road, the one that led back to the state route, back to civilization, back to places where the sky was sky, and corners stayed corners. In the rearview mirror, Briarwood receded. The blue overhead held for another moment, then began to crack at the edges, real sky bleeding through. The clouds at the forest's edge resumed their normal drift. Distance stopped compressing in the mirror. The world started behaving like a world again. Joe reached over and put his hand on the dog's head. The doodle leaned into the touch. "Best damn dog I ever met." His voice cracked. The dog's tail thumped once against the seat. Joe didn't stop driving until the gas station appeared in the bend. Dennis's station. White cinder block and that sun-bleached Pepsi sign with its stuttering bees. Except the bees were gone now. The sign hung crooked. Paint flaked down to bare metal in places. Joe pulled in and the gravel crunched differently, like it hadn't been driven on in years. He killed the engine. Silence. No hum from inside the building. No flicker of fluorescence through the dusty windows. Joe got out slowly. The pump stood alone, its hose cracked and dry, rotted, the numbers frozen. He tried the station door. Locked. He cupped his hands against the glass and peered inside. Empty. Dust thick on every surface. The receipt printer sat on the counter, paper curled and yellowed. The TV in the corner was gone, just a dark rectangle on the wall where it had hung. The flypaper strip dangled in shreds. Joe backed away, heart hammering. He looked down at his truck's dashboard through the open door. The fuel gauge hovered above a quarter tank, just enough to get him to a gas station closer to home. He frowned at it. Sure, he'd filled up here this morning. He'd watched the numbers roll. The almonds. They'd fallen off the dash, rolled onto the passenger floor mat. The tin was there, pull tab lid exactly as he remembered. Joe picked it up. The metal felt lighter than it should. He pulled the tab, and inside the almonds had shriveled to dark, brittle husks. Ancient. Desiccated. He touched one, and it crumbled to dust between his fingers. The dog looked up at him, brown eyes calm, then returned its gaze to the road ahead. Real. The dog was real. Warm, breathing, present. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Actual signal. Actual service. Joe pulled it out with shaking hands. It was from Mr. Farkas. "Joe, drove by this afternoon and saw your truck was gone. Checked the ledger board, looks perfect. Really appreciate the solid work. Quick question. Would you be interested in building us a small shed out back? Nothing fancy. Let me know. Joe typed carefully. Thanks for the kind words. Glad it turned out well. I appreciate the offer, but I'm pretty booked up for the foreseeable future. Best of luck with the shed. He hit send, paused, looked at the dog beside him, panting softly, tail thumping against the seat. He typed again. P.S. Your dog followed me out, jumped in my car without asking. He's with me now, safe and sound. Let me know when you'd like me to drop him off. The reply came within seconds. Dog? We don't have a dog. Joe stared at the screen, read it again. The dog shifted beside him, leaned against his leg, warm and solid and real. He looked back at the abandoned gas station, at Dennis's counter, visible through the dusty glass where no one had stood for years, at the pump that had dispensed gasoline into a tank that was somehow, impossibly, empty, at the tin of ancient almonds that had been fresh, well, more fresh this morning. But the dog was real. The ledger board was fixed. Mr. Farkas was happy with the work. Time had passed. The world was still here. So Joe pocketed his phone. He reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. The doodle leaned into it, tail thumping harder. Well, Joe said quietly, guess you're mine now. He started the engine and pulled out onto the state route, heading for the interstate. The dog settled into the seat content. In the rearview mirror, the abandoned gas station shrank to nothing. Beyond it, somewhere in the distance, Briarwood waited, patient as always, and ready for the next contractor who would take the job. Joe merged onto I-90 westbound, putting miles between himself and that forgotten pocket of the county. The dog watched the road ahead, ears pricked forward as if guiding them home. The afternoon sun was normal, warm, and casting proper shadows. The exits appeared where they were supposed to appear. The mile markers counted up in a predictable sequence. The world made sense again, well, as much as it usually did. Did it all really happen? Well, Joe believed it. He had the dog to prove it. And in his toolbox, mixed with sawdust and wood shavings, sat a few strands of pink surveyor's ribbon he didn't remember collecting, waiting patiently for the day he might be foolish enough to look at them too long and wonder where they wanted to lead him. But not today. Today, the interstate stretched ahead, straight and true, and blessedly, perfectly square. End of The Job in Briarwood by John Van Stan. Thanks for watching.